Let's start with something most people misunderstand about avoidant behavior. The issue is not necessarily that they don't feel deeply. Sometimes the issue is that they feel deeply and then immediately try to regain control. Think about what happens when a person has learned that emotional independence is their safest position. They become comfortable managing their own needs, their own schedule, their own emotions, and their own expectations. They know how to function without depending on anyone. And because they have practiced that independence for so long, it can begin to feel like strength. But then someone enters their life who matters. Suddenly, something changes. This person occupies their thoughts. Their approval matters. Their absence is noticeable. Their attention feels powerful. Their rejection would hurt. And now the avoidant is facing something they cannot simply organize, rationalize, or control. They are no longer dealing with an ordinary attraction. They are dealing with emotional significance. And emotional significance creates vulnerability. This is where the unpleasant feeling begins, the feeling of losing control. An avoidant may think, consciously or unconsciously, why am I thinking about this person so much? Why do I care whether they respond? Why does their distance bother me? Why do I feel exposed around them? Instead of becoming curious about those emotions, they may attempt to eliminate them. They create distance. They become less available. They become unusually independent. They convince themselves that they were never that interested in the first place. Why? Because distance restores the illusion of control. When you're close, you can be hurt. When you care, you can be rejected. When you depend emotionally, you can experience uncertainty. But when you create enough distance, you can tell yourself, I'm fine. I don't need anybody. And for a while, that strategy works. But here's the psychological paradox. The more important the relationship becomes, the less effective emotional control becomes. You can control your behavior, but you cannot always control attachment. You can control whether you send the message, but you cannot necessarily control whether you think about the person. You can control whether you show vulnerability, but you cannot always control the feeling of missing someone. You can control proximity, but you cannot always control emotional impact. That's why the unpleasant feeling of losing control can become transformative. Not because someone should manipulate an avoidant into feeling insecure. Not because you should disappear to make them chase you. And certainly not because emotional pain is some magical formula for commitment. The deeper truth is that real intimacy requires surrendering the fantasy of total emotional control. You cannot love someone deeply and guarantee that you will never be hurt. You cannot commit and guarantee that everything will always work out. You cannot become vulnerable while remaining completely protected. At some point, love asks you to step beyond certainty. And that's where an avoidant has a choice. They can continue running every time emotional intensity rises, or they can begin asking a more courageous question, what if this discomfort isn't a warning that I should leave? What if it's evidence that something meaningful is happening inside me? That question changes everything. Because commitment isn't the absence of fear. Commitment is the decision that something valuable deserves your presence even when fear is present. And when an avoidant begins learning that they can experience vulnerability without being destroyed by it, something extraordinary happens. The feeling they once interpreted as danger can gradually become intimacy. The uncertainty they once escaped can become emotional depth. The loss of control they feared can become trust. So don't confuse emotional discomfort with emotional danger. Sometimes discomfort is simply the nervous system standing at the edge of growth. And here's the truth I want you to remember. You don't fall in love by controlling your feelings. You fall deeper when you finally have the courage to feel them. And once an avoidant begins confronting that loss of control, something even more uncomfortable can emerge. The experience of actually missing you. Now, this is important because missing someone is not the same thing as simply thinking about them. You can think about a person intellectually without being emotionally connected to them. But when you genuinely miss someone, their absence begins to have emotional weight. Their silence feels different. Their presence is no longer something you casually appreciate. It becomes something you recognize as meaningful. And for someone who has built their emotional world around independence, that realization can be deeply unsettling. Because when you're constantly around someone, you can sometimes avoid understanding what they mean to you. Their presence becomes familiar. You know they're there. You can interact with them, pull back when you feel overwhelmed, reconnect when you feel comfortable, and maintain the emotional distance that makes you feel safe. But distance changes the equation. When you no longer have immediate access to someone, Your mind begins filling in the empty space. You remember conversations. You remember their voice. You remember small moments that seemed insignificant at the time. You begin noticing the emotional role that person played in your life, and suddenly the absence becomes information. This is why silence can reveal things that proximity sometimes hides. Not because silence is a manipulation tactic, but because space removes distractions. When the other person is no longer constantly available, the avoidant may finally encounter emotions that were previously buried beneath routine and emotional self-protection. They may begin asking themselves, why do I keep thinking about them? Then another question appears. Why does it bother me that they're not here? And eventually, perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, what if I actually don't want to lose them? That's where emotional awareness begins. But here's where people often make a mistake. They hear this and think, so I should disappear. I should make the avoidant miss me. That's not the lesson. The lesson is that you cannot do someone's emotional processing for them. If you constantly chase, explain, reassure, pursue, and make yourself available regardless of how they behave, you may unintentionally prevent them from experiencing the natural consequences of distance. You're constantly filling the emotional space they would otherwise have to confront themselves. Healthy space isn't punishment. Healthy space is reality, and reality can be powerful. When an avoidant finally sits with missing someone, instead of immediately distracting themselves, they have an opportunity to discover something profound. Missing someone does not mean weakness. It means connection has significance. That distinction matters. For someone accustomed to emotional self-sufficiency, dependence and attachment can feel like the same thing. They're not. Healthy attachment doesn't mean surrendering your identity. It means allowing another person to matter without treating that emotional importance as a threat. And that's a major psychological transition. The avoidant begins moving from, I need to get away from this feeling, toward, I can tolerate this feeling long enough to understand it. That is emotional maturity, because love is not proven by how little you need someone. Love is demonstrated by your willingness to remain emotionally present when someone matters to you. And sometimes the feeling of missing someone becomes the bridge between avoidance and awareness. It forces the mind to acknowledge what the defenses were trying to minimize. The person is gone, but the feeling remains. The conversation ended, but the emotional impact remains. The distance increased, but the attachment became clearer. And now the avoidant has a choice: escape the feeling again, or listen to what the feeling is trying to teach. Because sometimes the most uncomfortable emotion isn't telling you to run. Sometimes missing someone is your heart finally telling the truth your defenses were trying to hide. And once an avoidant has learned to sit with the discomfort of missing someone, another even deeper feeling can emerge: the fear that the person they have taken for granted might actually move on. Now, I want to be very precise here. This is not about creating jealousy. It is not about playing games, withholding affection to provoke a reaction, or deliberately trying to make someone insecure. Those tactics may create emotional intensity, but emotional intensity is not the same thing as love. And fear is not the same thing as commitment. What we're talking about is something much more fundamental: the realization that another human being has freedom. You cannot own someone's presence. You cannot assume someone will wait forever. You cannot repeatedly create distance and expect the relationship to remain frozen in place until you're finally ready. And for an avoidant, that realization can be profoundly uncomfortable. Why? Because emotional distance can create an illusion of control. When you are the person pulling away, you may feel that you control the pace of intimacy. You decide when to come closer. You decide when to create space. You decide when conversations happen and when they stop. But the moment the other person recognizes their own worth and stops organizing their life around your availability, the power dynamic changes. Suddenly, the avoidant is no longer the only person capable of creating distance. The other person can walk away too. And that can trigger a very important psychological realization: I may actually lose this person. That thought can be uncomfortable because it forces the avoidant to confront the consequences of their own behavior. As long as they believe the other person will always be there, there may be little urgency to examine their patterns. But when permanence is no longer guaranteed, reality becomes impossible to ignore. This is where commitment begins to become a question of values. Ask yourself, what do you value when you know you cannot keep it automatically? Think about almost anything meaningful in life. We appreciate time because it is limited. We appreciate opportunities because they can disappear. We appreciate relationships because people are not possessions. Their presence is a choice. Love becomes deeper when we understand that the person beside us is free to leave and chooses to stay. That is fundamentally different from dependency. An avoidant may initially interpret this realization as anxiety. What if they leave? What if someone else gives them what I wouldn't? What if I've waited too long? But beneath that anxiety may be something far more valuable. Recognition. Recognition that this person matters. Recognition that their absence would create a real loss. Recognition that emotional avoidance has a cost. And that is the uncomfortable feeling that can force self-reflection. But here's where you must protect yourself from a dangerous misunderstanding. You should never become responsible for creating this fear in another person. You don't need to prove your value by making someone afraid of losing you. Your job is not to become emotionally unavailable so someone else finally appreciates you. Your job is to become unavailable to disrespect, inconsistency, and endless emotional uncertainty. There is a difference. When you establish healthy boundaries, you are not saying, I'm going to make you chase me. You're saying, I will not abandon myself just because you are afraid of intimacy. That distinction is powerful because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop trying to convince someone to choose you. Let them choose. If they care, they have an opportunity to demonstrate it. If they miss you, they can acknowledge it. If they fear losing you, they can decide what that feeling means. And if they genuinely want a relationship, they can begin behaving like someone who wants one. That's where words stop being enough. Commitment is ultimately behavioral. An avoidant can say, I care about you, and still remain emotionally unavailable. They can miss you and still refuse intimacy. They can fear losing you and still do nothing about it. So the feeling itself is not the destination. The feeling is the invitation. The real transformation occurs when the person takes responsibility for what that feeling reveals. Maybe they realize, I've been protecting myself so aggressively that I've been protecting myself out of the very relationship I wanted. Maybe they realize, I kept assuming this person would always be there, and now I'm confronting the possibility that they won't. Maybe they realize, if I want love, I have to participate in creating it. So that is the turning point. Because genuine commitment isn't created when someone becomes terrified of losing you. It is created when the possibility of losing you awakens enough clarity for them to stop running from what they truly value. And remember this, you don't prove your worth by making someone afraid to lose you. You prove it by refusing to lose yourself while they decide. And once an avoidant begins to recognize that they could actually lose someone they value, another uncomfortable reality comes forward: vulnerability. This is where the entire conversation becomes deeper, because vulnerability is not simply about telling someone how you feel. Vulnerability is the willingness to let another person know that they matter to you without having complete control over what happens next. And for someone who has learned to protect themselves through emotional distance, that can feel dangerous. Think about what vulnerability really requires. It requires uncertainty. You say, I care about you, without knowing exactly how the other person will respond. You admit that you miss someone without knowing whether they miss you equally. You communicate a need without knowing whether that need will be welcomed. You're exposing something that could potentially be rejected. That is precisely why vulnerability can feel so unpleasant. But here's the paradox. The very thing an avoidant may experience as a threat is also the doorway through which genuine intimacy becomes possible. You cannot build deep emotional connection while remaining completely protected. You can build chemistry while protected. You can build attraction while protected. You can even build a relationship based on routine while protected. But emotional intimacy requires something more. It requires presence. It requires honesty. It requires the courage to be seen. And being seen means giving up some control over how you are perceived. This is why an avoidant may sometimes become uncomfortable when a relationship gets emotionally serious. The early stages can feel relatively safe because there is mystery, excitement, and enough distance to maintain independence. But as emotional intimacy increases, the stakes increase. The person starts to matter. And when someone matters, their opinion matters. Their rejection matters. Their absence matters. Their disappointment matters. Suddenly, the emotional armor that once felt protective begins to feel restrictive. The avoidant may think, if I let this person know how much I care, they could hurt me. And that thought is not irrational. Anyone who loves deeply accepts the possibility of pain, but the mistake is believing that avoiding vulnerability eliminates vulnerability. It doesn't. It simply changes the form of the pain. You may avoid the pain of rejection, but experience the pain of loneliness. You may avoid dependence, but experience emotional isolation. You may avoid being hurt by someone, but eventually hurt because you never allowed yourself to fully connect. Every strategy has a cost, and emotional avoidance has a cost too. This is where maturity begins. The goal is not to eliminate fear. The goal is to develop the capacity to act according to your values while fear is present. That's true for everyone, not just avoidance. Courage isn't the absence of discomfort. Courage is the ability to remain aligned with what matters while discomfort is happening. So when an avoidant finally says, I miss you, that may seem like a small sentence. Psychologically, it can represent something much larger. It can mean, I'm allowing you to see that you affect me. When they say, I don't want to lose you, they're acknowledging emotional significance. When they say, I was afraid, they're stepping outside the identity of the person who always has everything under control. And when they say, I want to try, they are moving from emotional defense toward emotional participation. But there's another important distinction. Vulnerability does not mean oversharing everything immediately. It does not mean becoming dependent. It does not mean abandoning boundaries. Healthy vulnerability exists alongside self-respect. You can say, I care about you, while still saying, I need consistency. You can say, I want this relationship, while still saying, I won't accept disrespect. You can open your heart without handing someone complete control over your emotional well-being. That's what secure intimacy looks like. And if an avoidant wants genuine commitment, this is the transition they eventually have to make from protecting themselves from every possible emotional injury to becoming capable of tolerating the uncertainty that comes with meaningful connection. Because love always contains uncertainty. You don't know exactly how long you'll have someone. You don't know whether every chapter will be easy. You don't know whether you'll always feel confident. But you decide that the possibility of something meaningful is worth the risk of being emotionally present. That is what commitment really is. Not a guarantee that nothing will hurt. A decision that what you're building is worth showing up for. So when an avoidant feels that uncomfortable vulnerability rising, the answer isn't automatically to run. Sometimes the deeper question is, what if this discomfort isn't proof that something is wrong? What if it's proof that something finally matters? And that question can change a person's entire relationship with love, because the heart cannot be fully protected and fully experienced at the same time. You cannot experience the depth of love while demanding the safety of never being vulnerable. Eventually, you must choose armor or intimacy. And once vulnerability begins to crack the emotional armor, something even more confronting happens. The avoidant has to look inward and face the pattern itself. This may be one of the most unpleasant stages of emotional growth because it is much easier to blame circumstances than to examine yourself. It is easier to say, the relationship was too intense, they wanted too much, or I just needed space, than to ask a more uncomfortable question, why do I keep doing this whenever someone gets close to me? That question changes everything, because avoidance is often not one isolated decision. It can become a cycle. You connect with someone. You enjoy the attention, chemistry, companionship, and emotional safety. As intimacy grows, however, something inside you begins to feel threatened. You become restless. You start noticing flaws. You question whether the relationship is right. You create distance. You feel relief. And then, after the emotional pressure decreases, you begin missing the person again. You remember what was good. You remember how they understood you. You remember the conversations, the laughter, the emotional familiarity. So you move closer again. And once closeness returns, the discomfort returns. Then you pull away again. This cycle can continue for years if nobody stops to examine it. And here's the philosophical problem. If you never question your patterns eventually become your identity. You start saying, that's just who I am. But is it? Or is it simply what you learn to do? There's a profound difference between identity and conditioning. An avoidant may genuinely believe they are protecting themselves. And in some cases, that strategy may have once served and important purpose. Emotional distance can provide a sense of safety when closeness has historically felt unpredictable, overwhelming, or threatening. But a strategy that once protected you can eventually imprison you. Imagine building a wall because you needed protection. At first, the wall works exactly as intended. It keeps danger out. But eventually you discover that the same wall also keeps connection out. Now the question becomes, are you still protecting yourself from danger, or are you protecting yourself from life? That's the confrontation. And this is why self-awareness can feel so unpleasant. Because once you see the pattern, you can no longer honestly pretend that the pattern doesn't exist. You begin recognizing your own contribution. You notice how quickly you withdraw when someone becomes emotionally important. You notice how you interpret ordinary relationship needs as pressure. You notice how you create reasons to leave when intimacy becomes real. You notice how you sometimes become attracted again only after distance has been restored. And suddenly the problem isn't simply, why are they asking so much from me? The question becomes, why does closeness feel like something I have to escape? That's a much harder question, but it is also a much more powerful one, because responsibility is not the same thing as blame. You don't have to condemn yourself for having protective patterns. You have to become conscious enough to decide whether those patterns still deserve control over your future. That's emotional maturity. And this is where love becomes transformative. A relationship can reveal parts of you that solitude never could. Someone gets close enough to expose your fears, your defenses, your assumptions, and your emotional habits. They become a mirror. And sometimes you don't like what the mirror shows, but you cannot change what you refuse to see. If an avoidant wants genuine commitment, eventually they have to become more uncomfortable with repeating the cycle than they are with confronting the emotions underneath it. That's the turning point. The question stops being, how do I get away from this feeling? It becomes, what is this feeling trying to teach me? Maybe the fear is teaching you that you care. Maybe the anxiety is revealing that intimacy matters. Maybe the urge to run is showing you precisely where your emotional growth is needed. And this doesn't mean every relationship should be preserved. Sometimes leaving is healthy. Sometimes two people genuinely aren't compatible. But there is a difference between leaving because something is wrong and leaving because intimacy activated something inside you that you haven't learned to tolerate. That distinction requires honesty. And honesty is where commitment begins. Because commitment isn't simply promising another person that you'll stay. It is becoming the kind of person who can remain emotionally present when staying becomes uncomfortable. That's the real transformation. You stop asking, how can I avoid feeling this? And you start asking, how can I become strong enough to feel this without letting it control me? That is where avoidance begins to lose its power. Because the moment you can observe your pattern instead of automatically obeying it, you have created a space between emotion and action. And inside that space is freedom. You cannot change a pattern you keep defending. The moment you face it honestly, you stop being controlled by it. And now we arrive at the deepest point of all. After confronting the loss of control, sitting with the discomfort of missing someone, recognizing that the other person can genuinely move on, facing vulnerability, and finally confronting their own patterns, the avoidant reaches a profound choice. They have to discover that commitment itself is uncomfortable, but that the consequences of never committing can be far more painful. This is where emotional maturity begins, because many people misunderstand commitment. They imagine commitment means finally reaching a place where fear disappears, doubts disappear, uncertainty disappears, and everything suddenly feels safe. That's not commitment, that's fantasy. Real commitment doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It teaches you how to move forward despite uncertainty. Think about what commitment actually asks of a person. It asks you to become emotionally accountable. It asks you to communicate when silence would be easier. It asks you to stay present during difficult conversations. It asks you to consider another person's needs without abandoning your own. It asks you to make decisions based not only on what feels comfortable today, but on what you genuinely value over time. For an avoidant, that can feel incredibly demanding because avoidance offers immediate relief. You feel overwhelmed, so you create distance. You feel vulnerable, so you shut down. You feel pressured, so you withdraw. And immediately something inside you relaxes. That's the trap. The behavior works in the short term. But what works in the short term can destroy you in the long term. You get relief, but you lose intimacy. You regain control, but you lose connection. You reduce anxiety, but you create loneliness. You protect yourself from rejection, but you also protect yourself from being deeply known. Eventually, there is a price. And at some point, an avoidant may begin asking a question that cannot be escaped forever. What is my avoidance actually costing me? That's a powerful question because it shifts the focus from temporary discomfort to long-term consequence. Maybe the cost is another relationship ending. Maybe it's watching someone who genuinely cared eventually stop waiting. Maybe it's realizing that the person you wanted is now emotionally unavailable to you because they learned to live without you. Maybe it's discovering that you spent years protecting your independence while secretly longing for intimacy. That realization can hurt, but sometimes pain contains information. It tells you what matters. If losing someone creates a profound sense of regret, perhaps that relationship mattered more than you allowed yourself to admit. If vulnerability scares you but loneliness hurts even more, perhaps the real challenge isn't finding a safer relationship. Perhaps it's becoming capable of tolerating emotional closeness. And that's where the philosophy of commitment becomes powerful. You don't commit because you are certain. You commit because you have decided what is worth uncertainty. You don't stay because every day feels easy. You stay because the relationship represents values you are willing to protect. You don't become vulnerable because you know you can never be hurt. You become vulnerable because being fully alive requires risk. And this is why the unpleasant feeling matters. The discomfort is not necessarily something to eliminate. It can be something to understand. Anxiety can tell you, this matters. Fear can tell you, you are entering unfamiliar territory. Uncertainty can tell you, you cannot control the outcome. And instead of interpreting those sensations as commands to run, you can learn to interpret them as invitations to grow. That's the transition from avoidance to commitment. But let's make one thing absolutely clear. Nobody should be forced into this process. You cannot love someone into emotional maturity. You cannot chase someone into secure attachment. You cannot sacrifice enough, explain enough, or prove your worth enough to make another person ready for commitment. They have to choose that transformation themselves. And if they don't, you have to choose yourself. Because commitment cannot be built on one person's willingness to endure endless uncertainty while the other person remains emotionally unavailable. Healthy love requires reciprocity. It requires two people who are willing to experience discomfort for something greater than immediate comfort. That's what separates mature love from emotional dependency. And perhaps this is the ultimate lesson for both people in the relationship. Stop asking, how do I make this feel comfortable? Ask instead, is this meaningful enough for me to become courageous? Because every meaningful relationship will eventually challenge you. It will expose your weaknesses. It will test your patience. It will require communication. It will force you to confront parts of yourself you would rather avoid. But that doesn't mean something is wrong. Sometimes it means you're finally growing. The avoidant who learns this doesn't become fearless. They become more capable. They still feel the urge to retreat. They still experience uncertainty. They still have moments when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. But now they don't automatically obey the impulse to escape. They pause. They communicate. They reflect. They choose. And that is what commitment really is. Not the absence of fear, the presence of choice. So if there is one thing I want you to remember, it is this. The goal isn't to make an avoidant suffer until they commit. The goal is to understand that genuine intimacy requires every person to become willing to experience discomfort rather than constantly escaping it. Because eventually, every human being faces the same decision. You can choose the temporary comfort of emotional protection, or you can choose the deeper fulfillment that comes from emotional courage. And sometimes the most unpleasant feeling isn't the enemy of love. Sometimes it is the doorway to it. So now, when you look at the entire picture, you can see what this journey is really about. An avoidant doesn't necessarily need to stop feeling afraid before they can love. They need to learn that fear doesn't have to make their decisions. They have to feel the discomfort of losing control. They have to sit with the reality of missing someone. They have to recognize that the person they care about has the freedom to move forward. They have to experience vulnerability without immediately treating it as danger. They have to confront the patterns that have repeatedly pushed intimacy away. And ultimately, they have to decide whether the discomfort of commitment is worth enduring for something they genuinely value. Because here's the truth. There is no relationship without discomfort. There is discomfort in being honest. There is discomfort in apologizing. There is discomfort in admitting that you care. There is discomfort in saying, I was wrong. There is discomfort in allowing someone to see the parts of you that you normally keep hidden. But there is another kind of discomfort, the discomfort of regret, the discomfort of watching someone you love become a stranger, the discomfort of knowing you had something meaningful and kept running from it, the discomfort of realizing that the person who once waited for you eventually learned how to live without you. And sometimes that is the most painful lesson of all. You see, emotional avoidance can give you immediate relief, but relief isn't the same thing as fulfillment. Running can make you feel safe today while creating loneliness tomorrow. Distance can reduce anxiety today while creating regret tomorrow. Silence can protect your ego today while destroying intimacy tomorrow. And eventually you have to decide what kind of life you actually want. Do you want a life organized around avoiding pain? Or do you want a life organized around pursuing what matters? That's the question beneath every relationship. And if you're the person on the other side of an avoidance behavior, hear this clearly. You are not responsible for teaching someone how to love you. You cannot chase them into vulnerability. You cannot prove your worth into their commitment. You cannot sacrifice your peace to keep someone emotionally comfortable. Your responsibility is to remain honest, maintain your boundaries, and refuse to abandon yourself while another person decides whether they are ready to participate. Give people room to choose. Give them room to feel. Give them room to confront themselves. But don't confuse waiting with loving. Sometimes loving someone means allowing them to face the consequences of their own choices. And if they return, let their actions speak, not promises, not temporary emotional intensity, not words spoken because they are afraid of losing access to you. Look for consistency, look for communication, look for accountability, look for vulnerability, look for the willingness to stay present when things become uncomfortable, because commitment isn't proven when everything feels easy. Commitment is revealed when staying emotionally present becomes difficult. And for the avoidant, the ultimate transformation is not becoming someone who never feels the urge to run. It's becoming someone who can feel that urge and still choose connection when connection aligns with their values. That's courage. And for you, the ultimate transformation is not becoming someone an avoidant finally chooses. It's becoming someone who chooses themselves, regardless of who stays. So don't spend your life trying to decode every silence, every withdrawal, every mixed signal. Build a life so grounded that another person's avoidance cannot determine your worth. If they grow, meet them where they are. If they commit, judge that commitment by their behavior. If they refuse to grow, let them go without making their inability to love deeply a verdict on your value. Because you deserve a relationship where love doesn't require you to constantly prove that you're worth staying for. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson of the entire journey. Love requires vulnerability. Commitment requires courage. And self-respect requires knowing when to stop waiting for someone to become ready. So let the avoidant face their discomfort. Let them confront what they feel. Let them discover what their patterns have cost them. And you keep moving forward, because the goal was never to make someone afraid of losing you. The goal was to become so deeply committed to yourself that you no longer fear losing someone who refuses to choose you.